The government must put the most modern medical means in the service of this knowledge. Those who are physically and mentally unhealthy and unworthy must not perpetuate their suffering in the body of their children. The prevention of the faculty and opportunity to procreate on the part of the physically degenerate and mentally sick, over a period of only 600 years, would free humanity from an immeasurable misfortune. The per capita income gap between the developed and the developing countries is increasing, in large part the result of higher birth rates in the poorer countries. Famine in India. Unwanted babies in the United States. Poverty that seemed to form an unbreakable chain for millions of people. How should we tackle these problems? It is quite clear that one of the major challenges of the 1970s will be to curb the world's fertility. These two quotations are alike in their mock show of concern for human suffering, and in their cynical remedy for it. Big Brother must prevent the unworthy or unwanted people from living. Let us now further inquire into the family background of our president, so as to help illustrate how the second quoted author, George Bush *1, came to share the outlook of the first, Adolf Hitler *2. We shall examine here the alliance of the Bush family with three other families, Farish, Draper, and Gray. The private associations among these families have led to the president's relationship to his closest, most confidential advisers. These alliances were forged in the earlier Hitler Project and its immediate aftermath. Understanding them will help us to explain George Bush's obsession with the supposed overpopulation of the world's non-Anglo-Saxons, and the dangerous means he has adopted to deal with this problem. Bush and Farish. When George Bush was elected vice president in 1980, Texas mystery man William "Will Stamps" Farish II took over management of all of George Bush's personal wealth in a blind trust. Known as one of the richest men in Texas, Will Farish keeps his business affairs under the most intense secrecy. Only the source of his immense wealth is known, not its employment. *3 Will Farish has long been Bush's closest friend and confidant. He is also a unique private host to Britain's Queen Elizabeth II. Farish owns and boards the studs which mate with the Queen's mares. That is her public rationale when she comes to America and stays in Farish's house. It is a vital link in the mind of our Anglophile president. President Bush can count on Will Farish not to betray the violent secrets surrounding the Bush family money. For Farish's own family fortune was made in the same Hitler Project, in a nightmarish partnership with George Bush's father. On March 25, 1942, U.S. Assistant Attorney General Thurman Arnold announced that William Stamps Farish, grandfather of the president's money manager, had pled no contest to charges of criminal conspiracy with the Nazis. Farish was the principal manager of a worldwide cartel between Standard Oil Company of New Jersey and the IG Farben concern. The merged enterprise had opened the Auschwitz slave labor camp on June 14, 1940, to produce artificial rubber and gasoline from coal. The Hitler government supplied political opponents and Jews as the slaves. who were worked to near death and then murdered. Arnold disclosed that Standard Oil of N.J., later known as Exxon, of which Farish was president and chief executive, had agreed to stop hiding from the United States patents for artificial rubber which the company had provided to the Nazis. As for the Senate investigating committee under Senator, later U.S. President Harry Truman of Missouri, had called Arnold to testify at hearings on U.S. corporations' collaboration with the Nazis. The senators expressed outrage at the cynical way Farish was continuing an alliance with the Hitler regime that had begun back in 1933, when Farish became chief of Jersey Standard. Didn't he know there was a war on? The Justice Department laid before the committee a letter, written to Standard President Farish by his vice president, shortly after the beginning of World War I, September 1, 1939, in Europe. The letter concerned the renewal of their earlier agreement with the Nazis. Report on European trip, October 12, 1939. Mr. W. S. Farish, 30 Rockefeller Plaza. Dear Mr. Farish, I stayed in France until September 17. In England I met by appointment the Royal Dutch Shell Oil Company gentlemen from Holland, and the general agreement was reached on the necessary changes in our relations with the IG Farben in view of the state of war. The Royal Dutch Shell Group is essentially British. I also had several meetings with the British Air Ministry. I required help to obtain the necessary permission to go to Holland. After discussions with the American ambassador Joseph Kennedy, the situation was cleared completely. The gentleman in the Air Ministry very kindly offered to assist me later in re-entering England. Pursuant to these arrangements, I was able to keep my appointments in Holland, having flown there on a British Royal Air Force bomber where I had 3 days of discussion with the representatives of IG. They delivered to me assignments of some 2,000 foreign patents, and we did our best to work out complete plans for a modus vivendi which could operate through the term of the war, whether or not the U.S. came in. Emphasis added. Very truly yours, F. Frank A. Howard. At S5. Here are some cold realities behind the tragedy of World War I, which help explain the Bush-Farish family alliance and their peculiar closeness to the Queen of England. Shell Oil is principally owned by the British royal family. Shell's chairman, Sir Henri Dunant, helped sponsor Hitler's rise to power at S6 by arrangement with the royal family's Bank of England governor, Montague Norman. Their ally Standard Oil would take part in the Hitler project right up to the bloody, gruesome end. When Grandfather Farish signed the Justice Department's consent decree in March 1942, the government had already started picking its way through the tangled web of world monopoly oil and chemical agreements between Standard Oil and the Nazis. Many patents and other Nazi-owned aspects of the partnership had been seized by the U.S. Alien Property Custodian. Uncle Sam would not seize Prescott Bush's Union Banking Corporation for another 7 months. The Bush-Farish axis had begun back in 1929. In that year the Harriman Bank bought Dresser Industries, suppliers of oil pipeline couplers to Standard and other companies. Prescott Bush became a director and financial czar of Dresser, installing his Yale classmate Neil Mallon as chairman. At S7 George Bush would later name one of his sons after the Dresser executive. William S. Parrish was the main organizer of the Humboldt Oil Company of Texas, which Parrish merged into the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey. Parrish built up the Humboldt Standard empire of pipelines and refineries in Texas. At S8 the stock market crashed just after the Bush family got into the oil business. The world financial crisis led to the merger of the Walker-Harriman Bank with Brown Brothers in 1931. Former Brown partner Montague Norman and his pro-at age at A.H. Jomer Shaft paid frantic visits to New York that year and the next, preparing the new Hitler regime for Germany. The most important American political event in those preparations for Hitler was the infamous Third International Congress on Eugenics, held at New York's American Museum of Natural History August 21–23, 1932. Supervised by the International Federation of Eugenics Societies. At S9 this meeting took up the stubborn persistence of African Americans and others allegedly inferior and socially inadequate groups in reproducing, expanding their numbers, and amalgamating with others. It was recommended that these dangers to the better ethnic groups and to the well-born could be dealt with by sterilization or cutting off the bad stock of the unfit. Italy's fascist government sent an official representative. Averell Harriman's sister Mary, director of entertainment for the Congress, lived down in Virginia fox hunting country. Her state supplied the Speaker on Racial Purity, W. A. Plucker, Virginia Commissioner of Vital Statistics. Plucker reportedly held the delegates spellbound with his account of the struggle to stop race mixing and interracial sex in Virginia. The Congress proceedings were dedicated to Averell Harriman's mother. She had paid for the founding of the race science movement in America back in 1910, building the Eugenics Record Office as a branch of the Galton National Laboratory in London. She and other Harrimans were usually escorted to the horse races by old George Herbert Walker. They shared with the Bushes and the Parishes a fascination with breeding thoroughbreds among horses and humans. At S1 at S0 Averell Harriman personally arranged with the Walker/Bush Hamburg America line to transport Nazi ideologues from Germany to New York for this meeting. At S1 the most famous among those transported was Dr. Ernst Ruthenium at Orden, psychiatrist at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Genealogy and Demography in Berlin, where the Rockefeller family paid for Drive Ruthenium at Orden to occupy an entire floor with his eugenics research. Dr. Ruthenium at Orden had addressed the International Federation's 1928 Munich meeting, speaking on mental aberration and race hygiene, while others Germans and Americans spoke on race mixing and sterilization of the unfit. Ruthenium at Orden had also led the German delegation to the 1930 Mental Hygiene Congress in Washington, D.C. At the Harriman's 1932 New York Eugenics Congress, Ernst Ruthenium et Orden was unanimously elected president of the International Federation of Eugenics Societies. This was recognition of Ruthenium et Orden as founder of the German Society for Race Hygiene, with his co-founder, Eugenics Federation Vice President Alfred Piello et al. As Depression-Magen financier schemed in Berlin and New York, Ruthenium et Orden was now official leader of the world eugenics movement. Components of his movement included groups with overlapping leadership, dedicated to sterilization of mental patients, mental hygiene societies, execution of the insane, criminals and the terminally ill, euthanasia societies, and eugenical race purification by prevention of births to parents from inferior blood stocks, birth control societies. Before the Auschwitz death camp became a household word, these British-American European groups called openly for the elimination of the unfit by means including force and violence. At S1 at S2 10 months later, in June 1933, Hitler's Interior Minister Wilhelm Frick spoke to a eugenics meeting in the new Third Reich. Frick called the Germans a degenerate race, denouncing 1/5 of Germany's parents for producing feeble-minded and defective children. The following month, on a commission by Frick, Dr. Ernst Ruthenium et Orden wrote the law for the prevention of hereditary diseases in posterity. The sterilization law modeled on previous U.S. statutes in Virginia and other states. Special courts were soon established for the sterilization of German mental patients, the blind, the deaf and alcoholics. 250,000 people in these categories were sterilized. Ruthenium et Orden, Piello et al. And their colleagues trained a whole generation of physicians and psychiatrists as sterilizers and as killers. When the war started, the eugenicists, doctors and psychiatrists staffed the new T4 agency, which planned and supervised the mass killings, first at euthanasia centers, where the same categories which had first been subject to sterilization were now to be murdered, their brain sent in lots of 200 to experimental psychiatrists, then at slave camps such as Auschwitz, and finally, for Jews and other race victims, at straight extermination camps in Poland, such as Treblinka and Belsen. At S1 at S3 in 1933, as what Hitler called his New Order appeared, John D. Rockefeller, Jr. appointed William S. Farish the chairman of Standard Oil Company of New Jersey. In 1937 he was made president and chief executive. Farish moved his offices to Rockefeller Center, New York, where he spent a good deal of time with Hermann Schmitz, chairman of IG. His company paid a publicity man, Ivy Lee, to write pro-IG. And pro-Nazi propaganda and get it into the U.S. press. Now that he was outside of Texas, Farish found himself in the shipping business like the Bush family. He hired Nazi German crews for Standard Oil tankers. And he hired Emil Helferich, chairman of the Walker/Bush/Harriman Hamburg America line, as chairman also of the Standard Oil Company subsidiary in Germany. Carl Lindemann, board member of Hamburg America, also became the top fairish standard executive in Germany. At S1 at S4 this interlock between their Nazi German operations put Farish together with Prescott Bush in a small, select group of men operating from abroad through Hitler's revolution, and calculating that they would never be punished. In 1939, Farish's daughter Martha married Admiral Harriman's nephew, Edward Harriman Gary, and Farish-in-laws became Prescott Bush's partners at 59 Broadway. At S1 at S5 both Emil Rich and Karl Lindemann were authorized to write checks to Heinrich Himmler, chief of the Nazi SS, on a special Standard Oil account. This account was managed by the German-British-American banker, Kurt von Schroeder. According to U.S. intelligence documents reviewed by author Anthony Sutton, Emil Rich continued his payments to the SS into 1944, when the SS was supervising the mass murder at the Standard I.G. Farben, Auschwitz and other death camps. Rich told Allied interrogators after the war that these were not his personal contributions, they were corporate Standard Oil funds. At S1 at S6 after pleading no contest to charges of criminal conspiracy with the Nazis, William Stamps Farish was fined $5,000. Similar fines were levied against Standard Oil $5,000 each for the parent company and for several subsidiaries. This of course did not interfere with the millions of dollars that Farish had acquired in conjunction with Hitler's New Order. As a large stockholder, chairman and president of Standard Oil, all the government sought was the use of patents which his company had given to the Nazis, the Auschwitz patents, but had withheld from the U.S. military and industry. But the war was on, and if young men were to be asked to die fighting Hitler, something more was needed. Farish was hauled before the Senate committee investigating the National Defense Program. The committee chairman, Senator Harry Truman, told newsmen before Farish testified, "I think this approaches treason." At S1 at S7 Farish began breaking apart at these hearings. He shouted his indignation at the senators, and claimed he was not disloyal. After the March-April hearings ended, more dirt came gushing out of the Justice Department and the Congress on Farish and Standard Oil. Farish had deceived the U.S. Navy to prevent the Navy from acquiring certain patents, while supplying them to the Nazi war machine. Meanwhile, he was supplying gasoline and tetraethylene to Germany's submarines and air force. Communications between Standard and IG Farben from the outbreak of World War II were released to the Senate, showing that Farish's organization had arranged to deceive the U.S. government into passing over Nazi-owned assets. They would nominally buy IG.'s share in certain patents because in the event of war between ourselves and Germany, it would certainly be very undesirable to have this 20% Standard IG pass to an alien property custodian of the U.S. who might sell it to an unfriendly interest. At S1 at S8 John D. Rockefeller, Jr., father of David Nelson and John D. Rockefeller III, controlling owner of Standard Oil, told the Roosevelt administration that he knew nothing of the day-to-day affairs of his company, that all these matters were handled by Farish and other executives. At S1 at S9 in August, Farish was brought back for more testimony. He was now frequently accused of lying. Farish was crushed under the intense public grilling. He became morose, fashioned. While Prescott Bush escaped publicity when the government seized his Nazi banking organization in October, Farish had been nailed. He collapsed and died of a heart attack on November 29, 1942. The Farish family was devastated by the exposure. Son William Stamps Farish, Jr., the lieutenant in the Army Air Force, was humiliated by the public knowledge that his father was fueling the enemy's aircraft. He died in a training accident in Texas 6 months later. At S2 at S0 with this double death, the fortune comprising much of Standard Oil's profits from Texas and Nazi Germany was now to be settled upon the little 4-year-old grandson, William Will Stamps Farish III. Will Farish grew up a recluse, the most secretive multimillionaire in Texas, with investments of that money in a multitude of foreign countries, and a host of exotic contacts overlapping the intelligence and financial worlds, particularly in Britain. The Bush-Farish axis started George Bush's career. After his 1948 graduation from Yale and Skull and Bones, George Bush flew down to Texas on a corporate airplane and was employed by his father's Dresser Industries. In a couple of years he got help from his uncle, George Walker, Jr., and Farish's British banker friends, to set him up in the oil property speculation business. Soon thereafter, George Bush founded the Zapata Oil Company, which put oil drilling rigs into certain locations of great strategic interest to the Anglo-American intelligence community. Will Farish, at 25 years old, was a personal aide to Zapata chairman George Bush in Bush's unsuccessful 1964 campaign for Senate. Will Farish used net Auschwitz money to back George Bush financially, investing in Zapata. When Bush was elected to Congress in 1966, Farish joined the Zapata board. At S2 at S1 when George Bush became U.S. Vice President in 1980, the Farish and Bush family fortunes were again completely, secretly commingled. As we shall see, the old projects were now being revived on a breathtaking scale. Bush and Draper 20 years before he was U.S. President, George Bush brought to raise science professors in front of the Republican Task Force on Earth Resources and Population. As chairman of the task force, then Congressman Bush invited Professors William Shockley and Arthur Jensen to explain to the committee how allegedly runaway birth rates for African Americans were downgrading the American population. Afterwards, Bush personally summed up for the Congress the testimony his black inferiority advocates had given to the task force. At S2 George Bush held his hearings on the threat posed by black babies on August 5, 1969, while much of the world was in a better frame of mind celebrating mankind's progress from the first moon landing 16 days earlier. Bush's obsessive thinking on this subject was guided by his family's friend, General William H. Draper, Jr., the founder and chairman of the Population Crisis Committee, and vice chairman of the Planned Parenthood Federation. Draper had long been steering U.S. public discussion about the so-called population bomb in the non-white areas of the world. If Congressman Bush had explained to his colleagues how his family had come to know General Draper, they would perhaps have felt some alarm, or even panic, and pay more healthy attention to Bush's presentation. Unfortunately, the Draper-Bush population doctrine is now official U.S. foreign policy. William H. Draper, Jr. had joined the Bush team in 1927, when he was hired by Dillon Red & Co. New York investment bankers. Draper was put into a new job slot at the firm, handling the Tixon account. We recall that in 1924, Fritz Tixon set up his Union Banking Corporation in George Herbert Walker's bank at 39 Broadway, Manhattan. Dillon Red & Co.'s boss, Clarence Dillon, had begun working with Fritz Tixon sometime after Averell Harriman first met with Tixon at about the time Tixon began financing Adolf Hitler's political career. In January 1926, Dillon Red created the German Credit and Investment Corporation in Newark, New Jersey and Berlin, Germany, as Tixon's short-term banker. That same year Dillon Red created the Vereinigstahlwerk German Steel Trust, incorporating the Tixon family interests under the direction of New York and London finance. At S3 William H. Draper, Jr. was made director, vice president and assistant treasurer of the German Credit and Investment Corporation. His business was short-term loans and financial management tricks for Tixon and the German Steel Trust. Draper's clients sponsored Hitler's terroristic takeover. His clients led the build-up of the Nazi war industry. His clients made war against the United States. The Nazis were Draper's direct partners in Berlin and New Jersey. Alexander Kreutzer, residing in Berlin, was president. Frederick Brandy, whose father was a top coal executive in the German Steel Trust, moved to the U.S. in 1926 and served as Draper's co-director in Newark. Draper's role was crucial for Dillon Red & Company, for whom Draper was a partner and eventually vice president. The German Credit and Investment Corporation (GCI) was a front for Dillon Red. It had the same New Jersey address as U.S. and International Securities Corporation uses, and the same man served as treasurer of both firms. At S for Clarence Dillon and his son C. Douglas Dillon were directors of USIS, which was spotlighted when Clarence Dillon was hauled before the Senate Banking Committee's famous Pocock hearings in 1933. USIS was shown to be one of the great speculative pyramid schemes which had swindled stockholders of hundreds of millions of dollars. These investment policies had prodded the U.S. economy to the core, and led to the Great Depression of the 1930s. But William H. Draper, Jr.'s GCI front was not apparently affiliated with the USIS front or with Dillon. and the GCI escaped the congressman's limited scrutiny. This oversight was to prove most unfortunate, particularly to the 50 million people who subsequently died in World War II. Dillon Red hired public relations man Ivy Lee to prepare their executives for their testimony and to confuse and further baffle the congressman. That S2 Lee apparently took enough time out from his duties as image maker for William S. Farish and the Nazi IG Farben Company. He managed the congressional thinking so that the congressman did not disturb the Draper operation in Germany and did not meddle with Tixon, or interfere with Hitler's U.S. moneymen. Thus in 1932, William H. Draper, Jr. was free to finance the International Eugenics Congress as a supporting member. At S6 was he using his own income as a Tixon trust banker? Or did the funds come from Dillon Read corporate accounts, perhaps to be written off income tax as expenses for German project, race purification? Draper helped select Ernst Ruthenium at Orden as chief of the World Eugenics Movement, who used his office to promote what he called Adolf Hitler's Holy National and International Racial Hygienic Mission. At S7 W.S. Farish, as we have seen, was publicly exposed in 1942. Humiliated and destroyed. Just before Farish died, Prescott Bush's Nazi banking office was quietly seized and shut down. But Prescott's close friend and partner in the Tixon-Hitler business, William H. Draper, Jr., neither died nor moved out of German affairs. Draper listed himself as a director of the German Credit and Investment Corporation through 1942, and the firm was not liquidated until November 1943. At S8 but a war was on. Draper, a colonel from previous military service, went off to the Pacific Theater and became the general. General Draper apparently had a hobby: magic illusions, sleight of hand, etc. And he was a member of the Society of American Magicians. This is not irrelevant to his subsequent career. The Nazi regime surrendered in May 1945. In July 1945, General Draper was called to Europe by the American military government authorities in Germany. Draper was appointed head of the Economics Division of the U.S. Control Commission. He was assigned to take apart the Nazi corporate cartels. There is an astonishing but perfectly logical rationale to this. Draper knew a lot about the subject. General Draper, who had spent about 15 years financing and managing the dirtiest of the Nazi enterprises, was now authorized to decide who was exposed, who lost and who kept his business, and in practical effect, who was prosecuted for war crimes. At S9 Draper was not unique within the post-war occupation government. Consider the case of John J. McCloy, U.S. military governor and High Commissioner of Germany, 1949 to 1952. Under instructions from his Wall Street law firm, McCloy had lived for a year in Italy, serving as an advisor to the fascist government of Benito Mussolini, an intimate collaborator of the Harriman/Bush Bank, McCloy had sat in Adolf Hitler's box at the 1936 Olympic Games in Berlin, at the invitation of Nazi chieftains Rudolf Hess and Hermann Goering. At S3 at S0 William H. Draper, Jr., as a conservative, was paired with the liberal U.S. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau in the vicious game. Morgenthau demanded that Germany be utterly destroyed as a nation, that its industry be dismantled and it be reduced to a purely rural country. As the economic boss in 1945 and 1946, Draper protected Germany from the Morgenthau Plan, but at a price. Draper and his colleagues demanded that Germany and the world accept the collective guilt of the German people as the explanation for the rise of Hitler's New Order, and the Nazi war crimes. This, of course, was rather convenient for General Draper himself, as it was for the Bush family. It is still convenient decades later, allowing Prescott's son, President Bush, to lecture Germany on the danger of Hitlerism. Germans are too slow, it seems, to accept his new world order. After several years of government service, often working directly for Admiral Harriman in the North Atlantic Alliance, General Draper was appointed in 1958 chairman of a committee which was to advise President Dwight Eisenhower on the proper course for U.S. military aid to other countries. At that time, Prescott Bush was a U.S. Senator from Connecticut, a confidential friend and golf partner with National Security Director Gordon Gray, and an important golf partner with Dwight Eisenhower as well. Prescott's old lawyer from the Nazi days, John Foster Dulles, was Secretary of State, and his brother Allen Dulles, formerly of the Schroeder Bank, was head of the CIA. This friendly environment emboldened General Draper to pull off a stunt with his Military Aid Advisory Committee. He changed the subject under study. The following year, the Draper Committee recommended that the U.S. government react to the supposed threat of the population explosion by formulating plans to depopulate the poorer countries. The growth of the world's non-white population, he proposed, should be regarded as dangerous to the national security of the United States! At S3 at S1 President Eisenhower rejected the recommendation. But in the next decade, General Draper funded the Population Crisis Committee and the Draper Fund, joining with the Rockefeller and DuPont families to promote eugenics as population control. The administration of President Lyndon Johnson, advised by General Draper on the subject, began financing birth control in the tropical countries through the U.S. Agency for International Development (USAID). General Draper was George Bush's guru on the population question. At S3 at S2, but there was also Draper's money from that uniquely horrible source and Draper's connections on Wall Street and abroad. Draper's son and heir, William H. Draper III, was co-chairman for finance, chief of fundraising of the Bush for President National Campaign Organization in 1980. With George Bush in the White House, the younger Draper heads up the depopulation activities of the United Nations throughout the world. General Draper was vice president of Bill and Red until 1953. During the 1950s and 1960s, the chief executive there was Frederick Brandy, the German who was Draper's co-director for the Nazi investments and his personal contact man with the Nazi German Steel Trust. Nicholas Brady was Brandy's partner from 1954, and replaced him as the firm's chief executive in 1971. Nicholas Brady, who knows where all the bodies are buried, was chairman of his friend George Bush's 1980 election campaign in New Jersey, and has been United States Treasury Secretary throughout Bush's presidency. At S3 Bush and Gray, the U.S. Agency for International Development says that surgical sterilization is the Bush administration's first-choice method of population reduction in the Third World. At S4 the United Nations Population Fund claims that 37% of contraception users in Ibero-America and the Caribbean have already been surgically sterilized. In a 1991 report, William H. Draper II's agency asserts that 254 million couples will be surgically sterilized over the course of the 1990s, and that if present trends continue, 80% of the women in Puerto Rico and Panama will be surgically sterilized. At S5 the U.S. government pays directly for these sterilizations. Mexico is first among targeted nations, on a list which was drawn up in July 1991, at a USAID strategy session. India and Brazil are second and third priorities, respectively. On contract with the Bush administration, U.S. personnel are working from bases in Mexico to perform surgery on millions of Mexican men and women. The acknowledged strategy in this program is to sterilize those young adults who have not already completed their families. George Bush has a rather deep-seated personal feeling about this project, in particular as it pits him against Pope John Paul II in Catholic countries such as Mexico. See Chapter 4 below, on the origin of a Bush family grudge in this regard. The spending for birth control in the non-white countries is one of the few items that is headed upwards in the Bush administration budget. As its 1992 budget was being set, USAID said its population account would receive $300 million, a 20% increase over the previous year. Within this project, the significant sum is spent on political and psychological manipulations of target nations, and rather blatant subversion of their religions and governments. At S6 these activities might be expected to cause serious objections from the victimized nationalities, or from U.S. taxpayers, especially if the program is somehow given widespread publicity. Quite aside from moral considerations, legal questions would naturally arise, which could be summed up: how does George Bush think he can get away with this? In this matter the President has expert advice. Mr. Clay Boyden-Gray has been counsel to George Bush since the 1980 election. As chief legal officer in the White House, Boyden-Gray can walk the President through the dangers and complexities of waging such unusual warfare against third world populations. Gray knows how these things are done. When Boyden Great was 4 and 5 years old, his father organized the pilot project for the present worldwide sterilization program, from the Great family household in North Carolina. It started in 1946. The eugenics movement was looking for a way to begin again in America. Nazi death camps such as Auschwitz had just then seared the conscience of the world. The Sterilization League of America, which had changed its name during the war to Birthright, Incorporated, wanted to start up again. First they had to overcome public nervousness about crackpots proposing to eliminate inferior and defective people. The League tried to surface in Ottawa, but had to back off because of negative publicity. A little boy had recently been sterilized there and had died from the operation. They decided on North Carolina, where the Great family could play the perfect host. Through British imperial contacts, Boyden Great's grandfather, Bowman Great, had become principal owner of the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company. Boyden's father, Gordon Great, had recently founded the Bowman Great Memorial Medical School in Winston-Salem, using his inherited cigarette stock shares. The medical school was already a eugenics center. As the experiment began, Gordon Great's great-aunt, Alice Shelton Great, who had raised him from childhood, was living in his household. Aunt Alice had founded the Human Betterment League, the North Carolina branch of the National Eugenical Sterilization Movement. Aunt Alice was the official supervisor of the 1946-47 experiment. Working under Miss Great was Dr. Claude Nash Herndon, whom Gordon Great had made assistant professor of medical genetics at Bowman Great Medical School. Dr. Clarence Gamble, heir to the Procter & Gamble soap fortune, was the sterilizer's national field operations chief. The experiment worked as follows. All children enrolled in the school district of Winston-Salem, then C, were given the Special Intelligence Test. Those children who scored below a certain arbitrary low mark were then cut open and surgically sterilized. We quote now from the official story of the project at S3 at S7, in Winston-Salem and in nearby Orange County, North Carolina. The Sterilization League's Field Committee had participated in testing projects to identify school-age children who should be considered for sterilization. The project in Orange County was conducted by the University of North Carolina and was financed by a grave accent Mr. Haynes, a friend of Clarence Gamble and supporter of the Field Work Project in North Carolina. The Winston-Salem project was also financed by Haynes. Grave accent Haynes was underwear mogul James Gordon Haynes, the trustee of Bowman Great Medical School and treasurer of Alice Great's group. The medical school had a long history of interest in eugenics and had compiled extensive histories of families carrying inheritable disease. In 1946, Dr. C. Nash Herndon made a statement to the press on the use of sterilization to prevent the spread of inheritable diseases. The first step after giving the mental tests to grade school children was to interpret and make public the results. In Orange County, the results indicated that 3% of the school-age children were either insane or feeble-minded. Then the field committee hired a social worker to review each case, and to present any cases in which sterilization was indicated to the state eugenics board, which under North Carolina law had the authority to order sterilization. Ray science experimenter Dr. Claude Nash Herndon provided more details in an interview in 1990. At S3 at S8, Alice Gray was the general supervisor of the project. She and Haynes sent out letters promoting the program to the commissioners of all 100 counties in North Carolina. What did I do? Nothing besides riding herd on the whole thing. The social workers operated out of my office. I was at the time also director of outpatient services at North Carolina Baptist Hospital. We would see the targeted parents and children there. IQ tests were run on all the children in the Winston-Salem public school system. Only the ones who scored really low were targeted for sterilization, the real bottom of the barrel, like below 70. Did we do sterilizations on young children? Yes. This was a relatively minor operation. It was usually not until the child was 8 or 10 years old. For the boys, you just make an incision and tie the tube. We more often performed the operation on girls than with boys. Of course, you have to cut open the abdomen, but again, it is relatively minor. Dr. Herndon remarked coolly that we had a very good relationship with the press for the project. This is not surprising, since Gordon Gray owned the Winston-Salem Journal, the Twin City Sentinel and radio station WSJs. In 1950 and 1951, John Foster Dulles, then chairman of the Rockefeller Foundation, led John D. Rockefeller III on a series of world tours, focusing on the need to stop the expansion of the non-white populations. In November 1952, Dulles and Rockefeller set up the Population Council, with tens of millions of dollars from the Rockefeller family. At that point, the American Eugenics Society, still cautious from the recent bad publicity this Adolf Hitler, left its old headquarters at Yale University. The society moved its headquarters into the office of the Population Council, and the two groups melded together. The longtime secretary of the American Eugenics Society, Frederick Osborne, became the first president of the Population Council. The Great Family's child sterilizer, Dr. Claude Nash Herndon, became president of the American Eugenics Society in 1953, as its work expanded under Rockefeller patronage. Meanwhile, the International Planned Parenthood Federation was founded in London, in the offices of the British Eugenics Society. The undead enemy from World War II, renamed population control, had now been revived. George Bush was U.S. ambassador to the United Nations in 1972, when with prodding from Bush and his friends, the U.S. Agency for International Development first made an official contract with the old Sterilization League of America. The League had changed its name twice again, and what's now called the Association for Voluntary Surgical Contraception. The U.S. government began paying the old fascist group to sterilize non-whites in foreign countries. The Great Family Experiment had succeeded. In 1988, the U.S. Agency for International Development signed its latest contract with the Old Sterilization League, aka Association for Voluntary Surgical Contraception, committing the U.S. government to spend $80 million over 5 years. Having gotten away with sterilizing several hundred North Carolina school children, not usually less than 8 to 10 years old, the identical group is now authorized by President Bush to do it to 58 countries in Asia, Africa and Ibero-America. The group modestly claims it has directly sterilized only 2 million people, with 87% of the bill paid by U.S. taxpayers. Meanwhile, Dr. Clarence Gamble, Boyden Gray's favorite soap manufacturer, formed his own Pathfinder Fund as a split-off from the Sterilization League. Gamble's Pathfinder Fund, with additional millions from USAID, concentrates on penetration of local social groups in the non-white countries, to break down psychological resistance to the surgical sterilization teams,